Hi, my name is Erin Royer. I'm a genetic counselor here at Sanford, and today we're going to go through a comparison of different types of genetic testing that you might hear about or interact with throughout your life. So we're going to go through different types of genetic tests. This was originally presented as part of the Imagenetics Community Lecture Series, September 10th, 2019, but now it's going to be available on the web for you guys to watch at your own pace and on your own time. As a roadmap for what we'll be going through during this discussion, I'm going to go through a quick background on genetic testing, and we're going to go through different types of genetic testing that are available, some of which you'll do in clinic or at your doctor's office, some of which you can do at home. We can also go through some of the raw data tools and options that are available out there and what to look for when you're trying to decide, is genetic testing right for me, and what type of genetic testing would I like to do? And we can even go through some examples, or I have some examples at the end that you can think through on your own time. As disclaimers, I am employed by the Sanford Medical Genetics Laboratory. I have no professional or financial relationship to other testing companies aside from what I use in clinic here at Sanford. I do have colleagues, classmates, and friends that work for many different genetic testing labs. For our discussion today, I won't be talking about specific labs or endorsing any particular labs or products that are available. I'll just be going through here some of the broad categories and what to look for. As always, no part of this talk is a replacement for medical advice. When in doubt, you can always talk to your doctor or your primary care provider or a genetic counselor. So let's start by defining genetic testing. It's not as easy to define as you'd think. For this talk, I'm going to talk about any test that looks at DNA as genetic testing. But there are tests that don't look at your DNA that can give you information about a genetic disorder. The classic example of this would be sickle cell disease or sickle cell trait. There's a test that looks at products in your blood to tell you whether or not you have sickle cell, which is a genetic condition, but it never formally looks at your DNA. We won't be talking about that type of testing today. I'll try to avoid using too much jargon, but I do want to get you guys familiar with some of the lingo that you might hear when you're talking about genetic testing or when you're reading about genetic testing. The first spectrum that we'll talk about is screening versus diagnostic testing. Screening is testing that is done on a broad group of people for the idea of looking for something in general. So you may not have symptoms of whatever the condition is we're screening for, but we're checking everybody for it. Diagnostic testing is done for a specific symptom or for a specific reason. You have a family history of something or you have personal symptoms. And then there is multigenic versus Mendelian. Some people call multigenic polygenic. So multigenic or polygenic health disorders are caused by common genetic changes across many different genes, whereas Mendelian genetic disorders are caused by changes in a single gene. The classic example of this is cystic fibrosis. If you have cystic fibrosis, you have changes in the CFTR gene. A common example of polygenic or multigenic disease would be something like heart disease. We know that a fair amount of heart disease, or our chances to develop heart disease, are actually based on a bunch of different genetic locations that can run in families. So you can see a family that has a lot of heart disease or a family that has almost no heart disease. When you're looking at genetic testing, you'll also hear some of the technical details. The first type of technical detail is, what does the testing do? Is it genotyping or is it sequencing? So genotyping looks for specific changes that we already know exist in those genes. Sequencing looks for any spelling changes within that gene or within that DNA sequence. The example that I usually use is if we think of a gene like a book, genotyping starts with, we know for some editions of this book, on page 110, there's a spelling error. Instead of cat, it says cut. So for genotyping, we flip to page 110 and we see, does it say cat or does it say cut? For sequencing, we read through the whole book and look for any typos in that book. Another thing that you might hear about when you're looking at genetic testing is panel versus single gene or even single site testing. So a panel will look at multiple genes at the same time. Single gene will focus on one gene. Single site will look for a single genetic change, a lot like genotyping, but single site is usually done when you already know the cause. Like, you know your grandmother has a change in this gene at this spot, so we might test you using single site testing for that. There are genetic specialists that are available to many people to meet with or even talk with on the phone. The most common or the most abundant would be genetic counselors. You can go to aboutgeneticcounselors.com to learn more about genetic counselors and even find a local genetic counselor. There are also medical geneticists. These are doctors with additional training in genetics. You can go to acmg.net to find a medical geneticist, and you can always talk to your doctor or your primary care provider to see which of these specialists would be helpful, if either of them would be helpful for you based on your questions. One of the common things that I hear in clinic is, I already had genetic testing. And that's great, but I need more information about that. That's like saying, I already had a blood test, or I already had an x-ray. Yes, but what did it look at? Did it look at your left arm? Did it look at your cholesterol levels? What was the testing for? Common questions you might get from genetics when you say, I've already had genetic testing, is, do you have a copy of the results? The results can give us a lot of good information about the testing. Do you remember what the testing was for? Do you remember who ordered the testing? And do you remember when it was done? State-of-the-art testing in 2005 may not be state-of-the-art testing now in 2019, and it may not be state-of-the-art testing in another 10 years. So for today, I'll be going through a very brief selection of genetic testing. There's in-clinic or clinical genetic testing, which is done usually at a doctor's office or through a healthcare provider. And then there's at-home genetic testing, which is also called direct-to-consumer or abbreviated to DTC. Genetic testing broadly can look at single gene health problems. It can look at that multigenic risk to develop a complex condition. It can also look at the fun genetic traits. We can look at genetic genealogy, or we can even engage in some genetic forensics. Clinical genetic testing is done through a healthcare provider. It can be screening or diagnostic. Clinical genetic testing is subject to laboratory regulations, and just like anything else you do through a healthcare institution, is subject to privacy regulations like HIPAA. When we're doing clinical genetic testing, it usually falls into one of two categories: specific disease or multigenic risk. Specific disease, so genetic testing for a specific disease, will look for a one gene cause of a condition that you have or that runs in your family. Examples of this could be hereditary cancer. So we know some families develop cancer much earlier than you would expect. They develop multiple types of cancer, or they develop cancer through multiple generations. So grandma, aunt, and granddaughter all develop breast cancer, or grandma developed breast and ovarian cancer. Some people also do genetic testing for abnormal heartbeats or cardiac arrhythmias. We know that in a lot of cases there can be a genetic component to our heartbeat, especially when our heart isn't beating in the pattern we would expect. So a lot of times when people have an identified arrhythmia, they might meet with a genetic counselor to discuss genetic testing options. You can also test for the risk for complex conditions. So this uses multiple genetic markers to estimate the risk. It's usually for a relatively common but complex health condition. Examples of this can be general risk for breast cancer. So we know there are single gene causes of breast cancer, like the BRCA1 and 2 genes, but we know that those genes do not account for the majority of breast cancer. In general, we say 1 in 8 women, or about 12% of women, will develop breast cancer in their life. But we know some families have no breast cancer and some families have a lot more breast cancer, but they don't have an identifiable cause. We think that that spread of risks can be accounted for by different genetic markers. So in some laboratories and some genetic tests, you can get a clearer risk. Are you at 12%? Are you at 15%? Are you at closer to 8%? This is also true for diabetes. We know that there is a significant hereditary component to diabetes, but it's not caused by changes in a single gene. It seems to be multiple genetic markers throughout our DNA. You can also do genetic testing at home. So this is not necessarily done through a provider. You may have a provider involved. It may be your provider helps facilitate testing through that at-home or direct-to-consumer company. Or that company says, we do have providers that review the testing, but it's not necessarily going to be your provider that reviewed the testing. It might be a provider in Tennessee or Utah that looks through the testing to make sure that it's being ordered appropriately as far as they can tell. At-home genetic testing includes a lot of different genetic testing options. Companies that do at-home genetic testing are not necessarily subject to the same lab regulations, and they're not necessarily subject to the same privacy regulations. Now, whether that's good or not depends on what kind of information you want. Let's start with the one that most people have heard about, the fun genetics, or some companies call them traits. Some companies call them vanity genetics, a lot like vanity plates. They're not necessary to identify your car, but they are helpful and they add a little bit of interest to your car. This can be things like your height, your hair color, your eye color, your preference for cilantro. So some people think cilantro tastes like soap. Some people love cilantro. The current thinking is there's actually a genetic marker that changes how your taste buds interact with cilantro so that you get more of that soap taste or you get more of that Mexican flavor. There's genetic testing companies that can help tailor wine to fit your preferences based on the genes for your taste buds. They can say, based on your taste bud profile, we think that this wine might suit you or this wine might suit you. There's also genetic testing for different types of earwax. There are 2 types of earwax, and it's mostly determined genetically. There are healthcare traits. So these are traits coded into your DNA that can be helpful in healthcare or in lifestyle management. This can include things like pharmacogenetics or pharmacogenomics, looking at genes and how they interact with different medications to help try to tailor your medications. It can also include things like weight. We know a fair amount of our weight is actually determined on a genetic level. Even sleeping patterns, there's some evidence to suggest that the patterns that people prefer to sleep in are coded into their genetics, whether you're a night owl, an early bird, you're a cat napper, you're one of those rare people that can survive on 4 hours of sleep, or one of those people that need 12 hours of sleep. Then there are genetic tests that can help you tailor your lifestyle to fit your DNA. So there are companies that will do genetic testing and tell you which types of sports you are likely to do well at or likely to not do very well at. Things like distance running versus sprinting or soccer versus American football. There's companies that will do genetic testing to help you tailor your exercise routine. Should you be doing more things like sprinting or distance running, heavy weightlifting, low impact exercises, things like that. There are companies that will offer to use your DNA to help tailor vitamins or supplements based on your personal genetic profile. And there are companies that will do genetic testing and help you tailor your diet. So we know that some people can eat tons of carbs or tons of fat and maintain an ideal weight. They will offer to do genetic testing and see, are you one of those people that burns through carbs really well and you can eat a carb-heavy diet? Are you one of those people who burns through fats really well, and if you eat a more fatty diet, you can still maintain your fitness goals? There's also genetic genealogy. This is the one that's probably been available to the public for the longest, and this is the one that's probably the most talked about or the most heard of. Different companies will use different methods, most of which are genotyping. Most genetic genealogy will offer to do one of 2 things, sometimes both of those things. They can help you find relatives. They match you to other people in their company records to see, are there any people here that seem to be your sibling, your parent, your cousin? I think they can go out to a 2nd or 3rd degree relative in many cases. Then there are companies that will offer information about the geographical area that your DNA seems to come from. So that is also based on the company's internal data from that area. So as you can see, anytime we're using internal data for a company, it's only as good as the data that that company has. So if you have a cousin, but they've never been tested through that company, you're not going to find that match. If that company says this is what German DNA looks like and your DNA doesn't fit with that, they might not identify you as German, even though you have the records to trace your family the whole way back to a small town in Germany. Many people who do at-home genetic testing, particularly genetic genealogy, might end up doing forensic testing, even if that wasn't what they were planning to do when they spit into the tube or did the cheek swab. I am not an expert in forensics and genetics. I highly recommend you see Dr. Rob Pyatt's lecture for full details. I think he did it about 18 months ago. It should be on the Imagenetics website as well. In forensics, we look at multiple markers that vary between humans to try to create a signature to say, okay, this is this person's DNA. The line between forensic and personal genetics is blurring, and the best example and the most notable example that I can give of this is the Golden State Killer. The way that the Golden State Killer was caught was they took an old sample of DNA from one of the crime scenes of the Golden State Killer, and they submitted it, just like any other sample, to one of the genetic genealogy sites. And they found matches, and then they worked backwards. Who are those matches? Who are those matches related to that fits the description of the Golden State Killer and lived in the area around the time the murders were taking place? And then they were able to narrow it down to, I think, 3 suspects, and it was just a matter of getting DNA from those 3 suspects to compare it to samples that they had on file. This created a lot of buzz because not everybody who signs up for genetic genealogy is comfortable adding their information to what may eventually turn into a police search. So when we get to things that we're going to think about when we're talking about genetic testing, I'm going to walk you through some of the questions you might want to ask for privacy and law enforcement. Once you do genetic testing, anytime you test DNA, it creates a data file. That data file may not look like what you're thinking. So most people, when they think of a data file or a printout for their DNA, picture something like what you're seeing on the right side of the screen. The 4 letters of your DNA printed out. That's usually not what the data file looks like. What the data file looks like is a bunch of identification numbers to tell you which of the many possible genotypes you have. So it's going to look like a bunch of little numerical barcodes saying you have this nucleotide or this polymorphism at this spot, and then at the next spot you have this one, and it'll say something like RS and then a whole bunch of numbers. And you'll end up with a list of RS number that's many pages, sometimes hundreds of pages long. In many cases, you might be able to get the text file of it, but in a lot of cases, your computer isn't going to really know what to do with that. It requires specialized software to turn that back into something useful. So in some cases, you can purchase additional services from the same provider. So say you did genetic testing for your sports aptitude, and now you want to learn about your cilantro preference. That might be something you can unlock from the company you already did testing with. Or you can retrieve that data, download it, and take it to a third-party vendor that can provide software that you can process that with. So when you're downloading that information, you can choose what tool do I want to upload this into. You can do a broader look at testing you already had. So let's say you did genetic testing for the 3 most common changes in the BRCA1 and 2 genes in the Ashkenazi Jewish population, and you want to take a broader look at the BRCA1 and 2 genes. Or you could look at a completely separate area. So you did that testing for the 3 most common BRCA mutations in the Jewish population, and now you want to look at how does your genetics impact your diet. Or you could use the data for a completely, I'll call it, unrelated purpose. So there are companies that you can do genetic sequencing, and you can purchase healthcare or fun genetic tools, or you can even do genetic genealogy. But you can also do things like create artwork out of your DNA, or even create a scarf out of your DNA. So you upload your file, There's 4 base pairs in DNA, so you choose a color scheme consisting of 4 complementary colors. Each color represents a base pair, and you get a scarf with 3 billion dots on it saying this is what your DNA looks like. I just provided a whole lot of information about different testing options that are available to all of us. How could you possibly work through all of this? These are the questions that I want you to think about when you're thinking about doing genetic testing. What information do I want? What do I think I'm going to do with that information? How much does it cost? And what are the company's policies? And what am I comfortable with? So let's start with what information do I want? Do I want information for medical management or for healthcare decisions? Do I want broader health and lifestyle information? Am I more curious about my ancestry and my heritage? Or do I want the fun stuff? Once I have that information, what am I going to use it for? If you're going to use it for healthcare decisions, this is the only solid advice that I'll give you guys for this talk. If you're going to use it for a healthcare decision, do it through a clinical laboratory, because at-home genetic testing companies may not necessarily confirm it, or may need to be confirmed on the back end. And if you're trying to make a healthcare decision, the time that it takes to confirm that result a second time may waste time that you weren't planning to take. So if you're going to make healthcare decisions, at least stop, talk to your doctor or a genetic counselor and see, okay, here's the testing I was thinking of doing. Is that going to get me the information I want? And is it going to get me that information in a way that I can use it? If you're going to make lifestyle modifications or starting a discussion, those are great things to think about. Are you going to use this to change your diet? Never change any medications without talking to your provider, but if you're going to use it to do things like change your exercise or start a conversation with your family at Thanksgiving, it's good to know that that's what you'd like to use it for, because that can help you decide what testing is going to get you that information. Anytime we're talking about genetic testing, we usually bring up the issue of cost. So the first part of cost is who pays for that cost. Is this something that goes to your insurance? Is this something you pay out of pocket? Can you use your HSA or your flexible spending accounts to pay for it? What are you comfortable paying yourself for that testing? If it's information that you think is worth about $100 to you, but the testing costs $2,000, that may not be the best option for you. Does the information seem worth the price? So when you look at it, I urge you to consider not only the cost that you'll pay, but the cost that might go to your insurance. If the information isn't worth what it's going to cost overall, maybe see if there's a different option that can get you the information. When in doubt, talk to your healthcare provider or a genetic counselor. We can't always tell you the best option, and we can't always find the perfect option for you. But we're really good at facilitating those conversations to say, here's the information that it seems like would be helpful to you. Here's the type of testing that can get you that information, and here's where you can get that testing. I will always urge you to read the fine print. The first fine print that I would like you to read is on privacy. Find the company's privacy policy. The things that I want you to look at what information will you provide? Can you withdraw your information, and how difficult is that process? Will they share your information with other clients, with third parties, or with public data sets? So when I say other clients, if you get a family match, do they just say you have a match? Do they say you have a match that seems to be a sibling? Do they give your full name and address to that person? For third parties, will they sell it to other people? Will they sell it to advertisers or other testing companies? Do they contribute to public data sets? In many cases, contributing to public data sets does help research, but we can't always guarantee that you can't be re-identified from that public data set. Most companies will also have a policy on how they'll interact with law enforcement. Some companies say that our database is open to law enforcement just for the asking. Some companies say we'll only share our data with law enforcement if they present us with a court order or a search warrant. I also urge you to read the fine print on data. Read their data policy. Figure out who owns the data. Do you own that data, or does the company now own that data? Do you have access to your data, and what format is that access in? Can you take it other places? Is it in a file that you can use in those other tools? And can you withdraw your data? Is that a hard process? If it's a hard process, it might be trickier to get your data out of that system. Here are some cases that I put together that you can certainly think through at your own pace. You can read it and think, okay, what type of information might this person want? What might they do with it? And then you can see, what type of decisions might I make in that example. That concludes our presentation. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. I hope we'll see you at a community lecture in the future. Thanks. Bye.